The undead aren't the only predators. When Adrian stumbles across looters tormenting others, he unleashes his full power. This time, it's not about survival, it's about justice. The city felt like a nightmare. Fires raged in the distance, the sound of groaning buildings and snapping metal echoing through the streets. The darkness was suffocating, the chaos relentless. Adrian had become a part of that darkness, an unwilling participant in a world that was tearing itself apart. His body was no longer his own. It was a weapon, a predator's tool that was hungry for destruction. He moved through the streets, his senses heightened, every sound amplified. The air smelled of blood and smoke. Zombies shuffled along, their groans mixing with the distant shouts of survivors. But Adrian wasn't concerned with the undead, not anymore. As he walked, the hunger in him churned, a constant, gnawing sensation. But there was something else now, something different, something controlled. He'd tasted blood, and it hadn't destroyed him. It hadn't taken him over completely. There was still a thread of humanity inside him. He could feel it. The streets ahead were empty, save for a few scattered figures. Adrian's eyes narrowed as he approached. Two men, just barely visible under the dim glow of a flickering streetlight, were dragging a woman, struggling, into an alley. Her screams reached Adrian's ears, and the hunger inside him stirred again, but it wasn't the same. This wasn't the same uncontrollable urge that had consumed him before. No, this time it was different. It was controlled, calculated. He felt the power in his limbs, the strength that had surged through him since his transformation. His muscles felt like iron, his speed as if the very air couldn't keep up with him. He wasn't a man anymore. He was something else, something far more dangerous. These men think they can take advantage of the chaos. I won't let them. Adrian crept closer, every step quiet as a shadow. His body seemed to melt into the darkness. The men hadn't noticed him yet. They were too busy with their victim, too drunk on their own sense of power to see what was coming. Adrian reached them in a flash, his hand grabbing the closest man by the throat before he even had time to react. The man's eyes went wide with panic as Adrian lifted him off the ground with ease, his grip tightening. He heard the man's gurgling breaths. Adrian's grip tightened around the man's throat, his fingers digging into soft flesh with a strength he couldn't control. The man's eyes bulged with terror, but Adrian wasn't even looking at him. He was focused on the woman. She was still on the ground, wriggling beneath the other man, desperate to escape. Adrian could hear her panicked gasps, but it didn't register in his mind. Not yet. The second man, realizing his companion was in trouble, spun around, his eyes wide as he reached for the knife hanging from his belt. But before he could draw it, Adrian was already there, his speed too much for the man to process. He grabbed the knife-wielding man's arm and twisted it with a sickening snap, pulling the weapon from his grasp. The first man was still struggling to breathe, his hands clawing at Adrian's forearm, but there was nothing he could do. Adrian's enhanced strength held him in place, suffocating him. The second man was already on the ground, clutching his broken arm, howling in pain. Adrian finally dropped the first man to the ground, watching him choke and sputter for air. The man was gasping, but Adrian was done with him. He wasn't interested in prolonging the suffering. He moved quickly, ending the man's life with a swift motion. The sound of his neck snapping was a grim confirmation of what Adrian had become. The woman lay trembling in the corner, her wide eyes locked onto Adrian. He turned to her, his blood-slicked mouth parting as he tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Her fear was so palpable it hung in the air, suffocating him more than the bloodlust ever had. "Go," Adrian finally managed to whisper, his voice hoarse, barely a whisper. "Get out of here." The woman scrambled to her feet, her gaze still frozen on him. She didn't hesitate. Her legs carried her away in a blur, vanishing into the shadows of the alley. Adrian watched her go, the briefest pang of guilt striking him, but it was quickly buried beneath the monstrous desires lurking inside him. But then, he took a deep breath. He felt the hunger stirring again, but this time, he fought it back. His chest heaved, his hands shaking as he stood in the middle of the alley, blood still dripping from his lips. The chaos of the world seemed to freeze for a moment, the distant groans of zombies and the crackling of fires fading into a dull hum. Adrian felt the weight of what he'd just done, the lives he'd taken, but he also felt something else. A thread of control. It was a fragile thread, but it was there. I can control this, he thought to himself. I have to. The world didn't wait for him to reflect. As if on cue, a low growl broke the silence. Adrian turned just as a horde of zombies staggered into the alley. They were drawn by the blood, the sounds of struggle. Their empty, hungry eyes locked onto him, mouths open, jaws snapping. Adrian's instincts flared up again. This wasn't about survival. This wasn't about protecting himself. This was about killing. But this time, the hunger didn't overtake him. It fueled him, sharpened him. He sprinted toward the first zombie, his movements fast and fluid, the world slowing as he closed the distance. He grabbed the creature by the shoulders and ripped it apart with one violent motion, tearing its arms from its body. The zombie didn't stand a chance. Adrian didn't even feel the impact of the blow. He was beyond that now. He was faster than any human should be, stronger than any man could dream of. Another zombie lunged at him, but Adrian dodged with ease, grabbing it by the throat and lifting it off the ground. With a sickening crack, he twisted its head, snapping its neck. It dropped like a rag doll, lifeless. Adrian stood over the fallen zombies, breathing hard. The hunger inside him pulsed, but it wasn't overwhelming anymore. He was in control. Adrian turned, scanning the alley for more threats. The streets beyond the alley were filled with the shuffling, moaning masses of the undead, but Adrian didn't hesitate. He moved toward them, one step at a time. He didn't need to fight every single one of them. Not yet. He just needed to prove to himself that he could control this, his new body, his new instincts. He was no longer just Adrian, the guy who worked at a restaurant. He was something else now. He had the power, but it didn't have to control him. As he stepped into the chaos of the streets, he realized this was just the beginning. The world was still burning, and Adrian wasn't sure where his place was in it. But for the first time since the transformation, he had hope. He could fight this. He could fight them. And maybe, just maybe, he could fight himself. The undead were everywhere, but Adrian wasn't running anymore. He wasn't afraid. Not anymore. The city had been reduced to a war zone. Fires crackled in the distance, casting an eerie red glow over the ruined skyline. The streets were a labyrinth of debris, bloodstains, and the scattered remains of a world long gone. Everywhere Adrian looked, the remnants of humanity lay broken, both in the form of the undead and the survivors who had lost everything. The quiet had descended like a weight, broken only by the distant moans of the undead and the occasional shriek of someone caught in the chaos. Adrian moved through the streets, his footsteps muted by the remnants of ash and debris. His hood was pulled low over his face, shadowing his features. But it wasn't just for hiding. It was to shield himself from the gnawing hunger that still clawed at his insides. He had learned a few things in the past few days. One was that he could control the beast inside, but it wasn't always easy. The more he fought, the harder it became to separate the beast from the man. His senses were heightened to an unbearable degree. Every sound, every movement amplified in his ears. His vision had sharpened, his eyes picking out every detail in the ruined streets. It was a constant reminder of what he had become. He could hear the distant thud of approaching zombies, the shuffle of their feet on the broken pavement. The hunger inside him stirred, but Adrian wasn't going to fall for it again. He couldn't. As he continued down the street, he found himself outside a broken-down pharmacy. The windows were shattered, and the once bright sign hung crookedly. The store had been picked clean by scavengers, but Adrian didn't care for medicine or supplies. He was here for something else. He reached up and touched his face, his fingers tracing the sharp lines of his jaw, the coldness of his skin. He didn't recognize the man in the mirror. He didn't want to. I need to change. I need to be me again. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. For a moment, he just stood there, staring into the glass, as if the answer to his new reality lay in his reflection. He had always been the quiet, hard-working guy, the one who kept to himself. But now, he wasn't sure who he was anymore. Was he still Adrian, or was he something else entirely? The hunger inside him, the power that surged through his veins, it was intoxicating. But it wasn't everything. It couldn't be. He refused to let it be. Adrian dropped the mirror to the ground, the glass shattering beneath his boots. The sound of it breaking was a relief. He was done looking at that stranger's face. The next few days were a blur. Adrian spent most of his time in the ruins, moving in and out of broken buildings, scavenging for food and water. But he wasn't focused on survival anymore. He was focused on something else, something deeper. He began to experiment with his new abilities, learning to control his monstrous form, feeling the beast within him, and learning to push it back. He spent hours in silence, meditating, forcing himself to think of something else when the hunger crept in. He focused on his memories, his life before everything fell apart, the way he used to be. It wasn't easy. Every time he thought he could suppress the beast, it would fight back, gnawing at him from the inside. But Adrian fought harder. He wasn't going to let it win. One night, while holed up in a burned-out building, he managed to get a full night's sleep without nightmares. It was the first peaceful sleep he'd had since the change. When he woke up, there was a sense of clarity in his mind. He felt more himself than he had in days. It was then that he made a decision. He couldn't just hide anymore. He couldn't just run from what he had become. He had to find a place for himself in this new world. He had to belong somewhere. The world had changed, and so had he. But that didn't mean he had to lose himself completely. There were still people out there. There were still survivors. And if they were going to make it, they would need someone like him. Someone who had the strength to protect them. Someone who could fight back against the new horrors that stalked the earth. As Adrian walked through the empty streets, a new purpose burned inside him. The power he had now was not just for survival. It was for redemption. He wasn't going to let the monsters of this world, human or undead, win. He would fight for the living, for the world that had been torn apart. But more than that, he would fight for his humanity. Because even in a world like this, Adrian knew there was still a chance for hope. A chance to rebuild. The sun had begun to rise, casting long shadows across the ruined city. Adrian pulled his hood tighter around his face, the warmth of the light brushing against his skin. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a purpose. And maybe, just maybe, there was a place for him in this new world after all. With blood on his hands and clarity in his mind, Adrian starts walking a new path, one where the monster chooses to protect. For more horror in the apocalypse, like and subscribe to Survival Horror Ambience.